Jesus doesn't take the side of the Romans. He doesn't take the side of the Jews. Instead, what Jesus does is he rejects all of those notions of power and privilege. He calls out all the abuses committed by everybody involved in that situation. And as a result, of course, he suffers. Because every time we do that, every time we call out the power and the privilege, the abuses and the injustices of those who are in power, every time we do that, we can expect to generate a lot of anger, a lot of resistance, and a lot of suffering. And so instead of playing that usual game of power and violence, Jesus allows his suffering to reveal the bankruptcy of our normal power games. Jesus allows his accusations against him. Jesus allows the mock trial that is set up as a sham to accuse him of crimes that he never committed. He allows the rising up of unjust power to crush him and eventually hang him on a cross. He willfully engages in that suffering because he knows that the suffering itself will pull back the veil and reveal that our usual way of engaging in these rivalries, engaging in these antagonisms, and engaging in this kind of scapegoating is actually a bankrupt way for us to solve our problems as a society. In other words, Jesus willfully gives himself as a scapegoat to demonstrate that that system of violence and retribution really doesn't work. And at the end of that first little story where Jesus gathers his disciples and he tells them that he's going to die, he hints that there is a resurrection coming. He says, after 3 days, I will rise. And so inherent in this story of willful suffering and willful sacrifice in order to draw back the curtain and reveal the bankruptcy of human power, in that sacrifice there is also the hope that in doing so, that something new and better is coming. You know, there's a great book by the German Lutheran Christian Dietrich Bonhoeffer called Life Together, where he unpacks a lot of the dynamics engaged in living in community together in a way that publicly witnesses to exactly the kind of public witness to justice and goodness and righteousness that Jesus embodies here in Mark chapter 10. And in Life Together, Dietrich Bonhoeffer says something really powerful I want to share with you today. He says this: Jesus Christ lived in the midst of his enemies. At the end, all his disciples deserted him, and on the cross he was utterly alone, surrounded by evildoers and mockers. And for this cause he had come to bring peace to the enemies of God. So the Christian too, that's you and me, the Christian too belongs not in the seclusion of a cloistered life, but in the thick of foes. You see, this life that Jesus models for us in these 3 short stories in Mark chapter 10 is not just a life of love and self-sacrifice, not just a life that is sort of cozy in a community of believers where we learn to love each other and we sort of stick together in that tight little community and we serve each other's needs. No, that's not what Jesus came for. That's not the life that Jesus modeled. Dietrich Bonhoeffer spells out very clearly for us that life of mutual service and self-sacrifice, and yes, that life of suffering is not just for us in our community of faith, that we're to live it for others in our midst that we might normally consider to be enemies or foes. I love the way Cornel West puts this. He says, justice is what love looks like in public. And that is exactly what Jesus is doing here in Mark chapter 10. Jesus is radically committed to a politics of love that remembers people and their suffering, that rejects privilege and power, and that reimagines politics not as a kind of rivalry or antagonism, not as a power game that ultimately leads to violence, but imagines politics as a way of people to live in community, in mutual love and service to each other, in spite of their differences, in spite of being enemies. And that is, of course, I think what it means to be the church, and that is, I think, precisely how the church is called to lead. If we were able to do that as a church, if we were able to be a people who were able to reject power and privilege, to remember the suffering of all the people in our midst, in and around us, and if we were a people who were willing to give our lives, even to suffer, to meet the just needs of those who are suffering, then I think that we would be a church that people might be compelled to join, to enter into life with, and to learn how to love alongside each other. Today, I want to leave you with those thoughts and ask that in your comments today that you would respond to a couple questions. The first question is this: how have you seen power and privilege abused by those who are in charge? It might be in church, or it might be in politics. It might be in a business or a school setting. But how have you seen people fall prey to that usual game of antagonism and rivalry and a fighting for power that leads to violence? And my second question is just the opposite of that. How have you seen people exhibit the genuine love of Christ in a way that rejects those power games and instead creates a new kind of revolutionary politics of love and service, even if it means suffering?